about that. So it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Marc Albert. As I mentioned, graduated in environmental studies and in American studies back in 1990. And he spent a lot of time with Dr. Norton Nickerson, who is the director of the environmental studies program, whose office was right next to mine my first year when I was at Tufts, and then he retired. And one of the features of that his time at Tufts was that he got to go to a program in the Bahamas, to Hummingbird Key, with Norton Nickerson and George Elmore. And if many of you will know George Elmore, but as you can imagine, that's quite it was a very dynamic duo. And so you get to the Bahamas over spring break and they say, we want you to practice the scientific method and go find something and do something to your heart's delight. There was no sort of organization to what you had to do. So George Elmore, who's a lover of all things plants, started pointing out the invasive species that were existing on the island. And one of them is this Australian pine. And Australian pine produces an abundance of seeds, and it can take over an island. And there was a large pine on the island. And so Marc decided that his job was to sort of help exterminate an invasive species from the island. And he had taken undoubtedly some plant physiology or something from Dr. Elmore. And so he was putting into practice some of what he learned, that if you girdle a plant, which means basically stripping the bark on the trunk on the outside, it might have the effect of killing it. And so he took it upon himself to girdle said pine. But of course, you don't know if that works. And so George conveyed to me that indeed, when he went back the next year, the pine was gone. So we had one less invasive species on the island of Hummingbird Key. So I say this as a way of sort of, I think we knew early on that Marc Albert had a career in environmental and natural stewardship. And that sort of set his career on a trajectory that probably wasn't completely linear, but I think the passion for the natural environment was always there. And he is currently the director of science and stewardship at the National Park Service, that mostly focuses on the harbor islands, but also a few of the sort of more urban parks in the Boston area. So he's really dedicated his life to sort of linking park management to science, and he has been facilitating science on those islands, including Jesse Thuma, who's sitting up here, who has spent the last year sort of exploring what are happening to pollinators in the national parks. And so we're really thankful for his commitment to science and sort of sort of looking at ways that we can sort of protect science in our national parks. And as I mentioned at the beginning, thank you for staying on to do a professional residence program. So Marc, I'm not going to take any more of your time. The floor is yours. Join me in welcoming Marc Albert.
Thank you so much. Sounds like I'm audible enough. Indeed, I'm the director of what we call the Science and Stewardship Partnerships team of the National Parks of Boston. And I was asked to sort of provide sort of how I got from environmental studies to where I am now. And this is sort of the one slide facts version. My talk is going to be a lot more about my subjective journey and kind of from my perspective, the sort of triumphs and tragedies along the way, because a lived experience is not like a list of a resume, and none of yours is either. But this is the facts. I was here and I first got an American Studies major and then stayed on an extra summer and semester to get my environmental studies major as well. I also was very involved with Peace and Justice Studies program, kind of, I'll mention that in a bit. I worked at a farm in Maryland and then went to UC Berkeley in plant ecology, worked for a couple other environmental organizations, the Nature Conservancy and the Natural Resources Defense Council during those years, for part of the time. And then started what became sort of my longer term phase of my career in the San Francisco Bay Area at the Golden Gate National Recreation Area, and particularly the Presidio San Francisco. Then I moved back to the east, to the Boston area, and worked in the inventory and monitoring program for the National Park Service. And then at a park just north of here, Saugus Ironworks National Historic Site, and then over to the Boston Harbor Islands and the National Parks of Boston since 2006. Okay, so there's the facts. Here's the feelings. My Tufts time. Idealism unleashed, crushed, and how I was saved by plants and humanity. In the Presidio, I had the sort of second revelation of my professional journey, the second phase of my idealistic nature, sort of being able to thrive and flourish. And then I had another real down time. And then I again have gone sort of on a sort of a wave function from dull pragmatism to what I regard now as a really positive place, a professional idealist. So that's what this talk is really about. And by the way, it's totally fine if you laugh at any pictures of me. I'd rather have someone laughing at me than no one laughing. And it's not a problem. These are old pictures, and I actually wanted to particularly be direct, honest, personal, and vulnerable in this talk. So I don't mind anybody laughing. All right, so I came to Tufts and immediately just felt like the interdisciplinary, connecting intellectual dots that I'd never realized could connect. I was in a first semester writing course that was in the American Studies department with Jesper Rosenmeyer, and talking about the late 1800s and the connections between art and philosophy and science and literature. And I was just like, wow, like the world is so big and connected and it's so exciting. And I'm going to change it, and we're going to change it. And the 90s are the new 60s. That was our thing. The 90s are the new 60s. US out of Nicaragua, US out of Honduras, stop clear cutting in the Pacific Northwest, you know, pro-choice, all these things. And so in my own way, a sense of a social revolution. My friends and I were, you know, pretty much cis hetero people who were not really feeling comfortable in that way, you know, in that sort of box. So there was a lot going on for me that made me feel like I'm changing the world, and we're changing the world. And American Studies was an amazing place to sort of connect, to be an intellectual while also feeling like I was building myself up as an activist. The sort of educational, you know, the academic connection for me was sort of the environmental movement and being an environmental activist and advocate. And I really wanted to make change, and I came in sort of whatever, tabling on the Tufts campus and protesting all this stuff. Got some small grants from the American Studies department. This is a page I pulled out from my own personal archives, where a friend of mine and I went to Hawaii, and we're just sort of living it up in Hawaii, but also we're interviewing people who had moved from the mainland to Hawaii about what it's like to live in, quote, paradise. And the project was, you know, called The Paradox of Paradise. And we learned a lot about pollution and healthcare and poverty and things that you don't associate with living in paradise. And that was very inspiring and interesting. We later got a second American Studies mini grant to go to the Southeast and interview people that live in the Toxic Alley down in the sort of Gulf Coast, and talk to them about what their experiences were of sort of environmental racism. So this was, I was like, this is awesome. Like, I'm becoming intellectual, and I'm also like figuring out how to change the world. And I had a semester abroad in London, working for Greenpeace UK as my sort of semester internship. And that's images from, I pulled up, you know, this week from the Greenpeace UK website. And I thought that's what it was going to be like. I thought I was going to be out there and like organizing protests or something, and like doing like banners, or, you know, hanging banners off things or whatever. And it was a lot more like this. It was a lot more like people who to me seemed much older. They were probably in their 30s, but people who just seemed like grinding. They were like grinding on like policy papers and like statistics about clear all the different important environmental issues of the time. And I really, really value and appreciate them. I still do. And I'm very happy those people are in the environmental world, in sort of part of the environmental movement. And it just struck me that I could do that grinding, and then someone could have some sort of backroom deal that I don't even know about before a bill is passed, and all of my work could just be like, nope, we're not doing that wetland regulation, or now all the wetlands can be developed or whatever. And it had nothing to do with the grinding work of those people doing their amazingly, amazing hard work. This is my journey. I hope some of you are doing environmental policy and gonna not feel this way, but that's how I felt. I felt like, oh my God, like that's not for me. Like I don't want to be grinding on policy papers only to have it taken away at the last second by some sort of weird congressional backroom deal. Came back to Tufts and took Plants in Humanity from George Elmore, and it kind of saved my professional life because I was really bummed. I was really down. It was definitely kind of a reckoning with the first reckoning with sort of the real world. I started to realize I'm not going to actually just be protesting and make a really huge difference by myself doing that. Got really into the idea that, oh, scientists can like study something and like they get their information and they do their project, and then it's like on the record permanently. Like no one can change that. No one can change the fact that like the study, that one tree study of the girdling of the casuarina, like that happened. That's a fact. It's observable. It's repeatable. It's a fact. And I was like, oh, thank goodness. And plants are amazing. And George helped me see that. Like, and he said, when I, in that class or in subsequent class I took with him, wherever you go in the world, you can feel at home. Because if you know plant families, if you know the plants. Of course, the same is true for other aspects of biodiversity, but he was the guy for me. So I did go to Hummingbird Key. Those are two pictures from Hummingbird Key, and loved it. And just it really changed my course entirely. I'm like, okay, I'm going to do like plant science, and maybe there will be some way again to connect to my desires to sort of change the world. Ended up getting, in large thanks to George, into UC Berkeley for the graduate program, and got really into plants. And the short version of that is I was in a PhD program, switched to a master's, because even that, I realized that I wasn't going to be a lab scientist who just grinded in the lab all day either, because I like people. I like to be in the mix. And the science wasn't exactly right for me either. So I switched to a master's program. And luckily, towards the end of that master's program, I was introduced to someone who worked at the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, and I got an internship there. And this is not the picture of that day with the musicians playing while we're up on the coastal scrub doing invasive plant removal. This was a later ecological restoration conference that I helped coordinate. But it felt like that. It felt like there were musicians playing, because there were high schoolers on this hillside above the Pacific Ocean. There were community volunteers. There were park staff. We were collecting data on this lupin and this butterfly. And I was like, it really was a revelation. I'm like, I can see how this connects. Like I can do science and I can love plants. And there's people here who actually want to be part of it. And I can convince them to love the environment without having to like protest about it. Like I can implicitly increase environmentalism rather than explicitly protesting and doing that. So that was amazing. And it did lead to the next sort of the next surge of idealistic flourishing in my life. There was a lot of nuances even within that, but luckily I got to the Presidio of San Francisco right at the time it was converting from an army base to a national park area. And the fact that it was an army base had meant there was, some pollutants in there, and a lot of the area had been, but actually a lot less of the area than if it had been residentially developed. So there were a lot of remnant natural habitats just sort of kind of untouched amongst the buildings and grounds of the Army base, including the central picture there is the serpentine rocky outcrops that hosted an endangered species called the Presidio clarkia and another endangered species called the Raven's manzanita, lots of rare plants. And within the same very small area, just down the hill, there are these sand dunes that also hosted an endangered species called the San Francisco Lysinga. And it was like, and you know, I was right there at the sort of front wave. I wasn't the very first few people, but pretty shortly thereafter. And we were like, wow, we are really onto something. We can get the community out here and we can save like federally listed endangered species right here in a city, like on the ocean, like next to the Golden Gate Bridge. There's like a nude beach right there, and there's the Golden Gate Bridge, and there's endangered species. It was so cool. So that was the period of my life that was probably the most exciting. We had an amazing sort of culture of sort of young professionals co-developing how to do community-based ecological restoration in this city environment, sort of living in the old Army buildings. Met my wife there during that time. And we were doing an amazing thing, it felt to us, growing native plants, collecting seeds, tracking pollinators, doing all these great things. It was amazing. And I really honestly didn't want to leave. But I had family back here. My wife had family back here. I'll add one more slide of this. That's us out there on Earth Day in 1997 on the right. Kind of ridiculously, I don't recommend running volunteer programs with that many people in that small of a space. We were just like, everyone come, and we would end up just going nuts. Like, we have 70 people coming today, and like the 5 of us who were like in our young 20s were like, okay, let's like figure it out. I would never run a program like that now. But anyway, we did it, and it eventually did, because there was kind of money in the Presidio, because of other reasons, big things have been able to happen. That, if you've been to the Presidio of San Francisco, I recommend checking it out. It's like pretty premier ecological restoration territory with endangered species and bulldozers clearing, you know, formerly covered over riparian channels. And the Crissy Field Marsh project that I sort of left right when that was we were in the midst of planning it, is an amazing public recreational resource that also has extremely high biodiversity value. It's a premier location to see how things in cities can be kind of nature and culture and recreation and sort of biodiversity value all at once. Anyway, oh yes, I almost got ahead of myself. So while I was there, this guy, Ryan Jones, was a high schooler he'd grown up in San Francisco. And the story he would always tell was he lived in a very small, like sort of row house situation with a tiny little backyard. And he would see the birds sort of going over his backyard, and he started drawing them. And he became a really passionate sort of artist, illustrator, just on his own in school, kind of an artistic kid. And he connected to the park. And he also, it turns out, was quite a nature enthusiast, quite an explorer. And he ended up staying on and getting a permanent Park Service job and leading other youth in illustration workshops, taking some professional courses in illustration, and demonstrating to me and to all of us at the time how critical it is to connect people to parks, particularly in urban park areas. It's easy enough to connect people to parks when they're sort of seeing a geyser, go off, or a buffalo in front of them or something. It's a little different in an urban environment, yet there's still the wonders of nature around us, even if just a bird on, on a light and a lamppost or something. And Ryan was an incredible and sort of signature example of that. And that's his drawing there of the Presidio Park Stewards logo. That was the community program we created. I have to share that very tragically, Ryan was hit by a drunk driver on the Bay Bridge when he was like 29 years old and didn't really get to have his career. But, he still meant so much to so many of us. So I had a family back here, or my parents, my wife's family is from Western Massachusetts. And we just decided we have to be near our families, even though we loved all that other stuff and it was so amazing and going so great. So sort of pulled up stakes and came out here and was able to, after a little bit of time, get a job in the Northeast Regional Office of the National Park Service, working on the inventory and monitoring program, helping parks up and down the East Coast. The inventory and monitoring program of the National Park Service sort of divides up the National Park Service units in the country that have significant natural features into these different networks, as they're called. So the dots are sort of the parks that are part of the network that is defined by the colors that define these geographic ranges. I was working for this one, the Northeast Coastal and Barrier Network, from Assateague Island in the south up to Cape Cod in the north. And my job was to basically facilitate meetings and gather the relevant information relative to sort of key vital signs, as they were called, of national parks. So really kind of intellectually cool work. But I just come from this situation where I was like thriving, you know, we're like doing science and all these volunteers and all these researchers and everything. And all of a sudden I was sitting in a downtown Boston office on the 5th floor. Literally, when I first got there, my desk was like between two bookshelves. And I'll never forget, my dad came in because he knew that he and my mom and my wife's family were the reason we moved and like gave up our awesome jobs and loving living in San Francisco. And he literally started crying when he saw my office. He's like, oh my God, like you left that and now you're like between two bookshelves in downtown Boston. So that was the low point of my little, you know, my sort of emotional journey here. The teardrop there in the corner was to remind me to tell that part of the story. You know, important work, again, just not for me. Like, I'm not someone who wants to be in a lab all the time, in an office all the time, in a, you know, doing stuff like that. I need to be with the people. So I just suck it out though, because, you know, at that point I had a kid and the Park Service was a good place to work because the mission is amazing. The mission of the National Park Service to basically preserve unimpaired the cultural and natural features of the national parks and provide enjoyment for the people. So preserve things unimpaired, provide enjoyment. Now, just a little side point here, that mission is not always possible, because preserving something unimpaired might mean people not doing too much loving of it. You know, I mean, at the extreme, you know, stepping on one footprint is probably harming some local microbiota. Obviously, that's not impairing the park, but multiply that times 8,000 footprints in this room area, and you might start impairing the park. So there's a real interesting challenge in the Park Service about resource preservation, so-called resource, and public enjoyment, visitor enjoyment. And all parks have to make that decision depending on what the purpose of the park is, what the different areas of the parks and things like that. But I was happy being in the National Park Service. Just want to do a time check. Okay. So I stayed on and I sort of made some connections, and it was made it clear that I wanted to be in a park, not sort of in the regional program. So I was able to get a job working on a restoration project at Saugus Ironworks, which is, as it says here, was the first integrated ironworks in North America, established in 1646 and operated for a couple decades. And the site there now is kind of a perfect or as perfect as we can do, sort of replica of that initial 17th century ironworks. This is how it was restored. There was a reconstruction, sort of a restoration of the historic setting before the Park Service got there in the 1950s. And this is the sort of signature photo of the restoration of the ironworks landscape. And you see there's a pond there, this is on a river, because the raw materials were brought in up the river, the Saugus River. They were then worked at the ironworks with the water-powered water wheel and, you know, fires and everything. And then the final products were taken out on a boat down the Saugus River. So this waterfront context is really critical to telling the historic story of the place. However, in 1957, just 2 years after that picture, there was a big dam breach just upstream. And what's called here the turning basin area is that's the area where the boats would turn around. That's what's called the turning basin. And the turning basin got completely sedimented in. So that other picture was looking from sort of the left to right across, and this whole area was water, whereas it had become dominated by invasive Phragmites and cattails and contaminated sediments from the upstream breach, and it had just had this little channel sort of going through it. So the historic setting had been screwed up, and the biodiversity of the river environment had been messed up. This was so the goal was the Park Service had competed for some money to restore that historic setting and the ecological values of the Saugus River landscape right there. This was sort of our example of what we were more or less targeting. It's a tidal river in that area, so it's kind of extra confusing. It's not a upstream river or an open ocean environment. There are rainbow smelt that spawn there, so that was something we had to be very careful about planning for. And I certainly began to learn the importance of partnerships and the importance of working with the human beings that are the Mass DEP, that are the Coastal Zone Management, that are the Army Corps of Engineers, that are the Marine Fisheries, that are, you know, researchers at University of Rhode Island. Up to this point in my career, I'd mostly worked with either, you know, community volunteers or my own colleagues. And this was the time I realized there's these bigger things that the Park Service does, or that, you know, any land management agency does, really require not just sort of sign-offs on permits and compliance, but relationships that lead to the sign-offs on the compliance, so that you both know what you're doing and so that people want to work with you. This was our plan. You know, basically all the green area was sort of dredged out and sediments dealt with. We put the river basically in a bag for the period of time during this project, so that we could be in this sort of narrow channel, so that we could then de-water behind it and remove all the sediments. And this is what it looked like in mid-process. The historic waterfront structures had been damaged by all that muck, and we got them back to their historic look and feel and function, and dredged out all the sediments, planted about 13,000 native plants throughout the area, and basically got the turning basin back to the setting we were looking for. It's the ecology of the site is more complicated. When Phragmites is on a site for a super long time, it changes the texture of the soil, and that ended up making the plantings really difficult in some of the areas. If anyone's really interested in the riparian ecology side of this, we could talk about it separately. But for this purpose, it was a success. It was good, and it is good. If you go there now, you can get a feeling for the 1600s in a way that you couldn't before. And here's a shot from the, you know, at a low tide in that following September. Okay, so I got that experience, but it was still kind of a bit of a technical job for me, you know, like planning, compliance, project management. And Saugus Ironworks is just kind of a small fish in the Park Service pond. So there weren't a whole lot of public interest. There wasn't like a lot of energy with sort of the community around there. I mean, it's a valuable place, but I didn't really feel super satisfied. So I did look for other opportunities, and that's how I found Boston Harbor Islands, which had become a national park not too long before then. It's part of the National Parks of Boston, which Colin mentioned. There are 3 parks that we consider technically part of the National Parks of Boston. You can see them here. The Harbor Islands. So just briefly, Boston National Historic Park, more or less, is sites along the Freedom Trail, if you're familiar with the Freedom Trail in Boston. Everything from the Bunker Hill Monument, USS Constitution, Faneuil Hall, Dorchester Heights Monument is also part of it. So a lot of things telling the story of America, the American Revolution, and other important stories of the history of the Boston area. In 1980, the Boston African American National Historic Site was created to tell the stories of the first meeting, well, the first school dedicated to education of African Americans in the United States. And that's at the African Meeting House, which is the original place. It's on the north slope of Beacon Hill, which was the smelly, unwanted slope until Boston cleaned up its, sort of its waste systems. So it was kind of the poor area of Beacon Hill. It's now a very, very fancy neighborhood, but at the time it wasn't. And there's a Black Heritage Trail that is the sort of core feature of this park, where you can learn about everything from that time period through the Civil Rights Movement. And then in 1996, Boston Harbor Islands became part of the National Park Service. Now this 1990, in 2016, the National Park Service had memorialized some thinking that we had been doing about how parks need to be more connected to people, and how many parks were not known to people. In fact, I bet you a lot of you in this room didn't know there were the Boston Harbor Islands were a national park, for example, or that there were 3 national parks in Boston itself. Also, the old model of parks are places where you just sort of put a fence around something and then it's pristine, and then everything outside the park is sort of not a park. That was obviously not how the natural world works. The original vision of, was parks the language was vignettes of primitive America. So like a vignette, like almost like a story about primitive America. Whereas now we understand, the field of ecological science knows that everything's changing, that there's no boundary that a natural system is going to obey because there's a political boundary around a park. Air pollution affects everyone, climate change, connectivity of habitats, all these things that are listed here, and the need for, or the desire for, people to enjoy the national parks who live in cities and who can't get on long trips. So the National Parks of Boston was created as this sort of concept for the 3 parks that include Boston Harbor Islands in 2016. And partnerships are absolutely essential. I didn't focus on it, but the mission of the Park Service that I showed before is actually an updated mission that includes working in partnership. That was not the original language of the mission of the Park Service. That's been updated. Okay, so the Harbor Islands, 29 islands and 5 peninsulas in the Boston Harbor area, established essentially both for a combination of the importance for geologic history and the layered human history of the islands. This is the slide I always show the people who first, the interns and staff who first come to the park, because this is how we are supposed to manage the park, as a system of kind of an archipelago of islands connected to the mainland. There are many populations of many species for which this is the relevant way to think about the park. At the same time, the park has 9 different landowners. So this is not like Acadia or Yellowstone, where you go onto parkland and you're on federal National Park Service land. Just about none of the park is that. So that's the importance of this view, because our job is to facilitate this, understanding and science, and to take care of all of the ecosystems and the culturally important sites, regardless of who owns what or whatever. So that requires these 8 other landowners agreeing with us to do things. We can't just sort of say we want to do it and then do it. Biogeographically, the park ranges from these windswept outer islands. There's a live camera that you can access on the park website of Boston Light. That's that top left image. And then in Peddix Island, you're seeing more of the maritime influenced coastal habitats, a maritime red cedar woodland. And then on Langley Island there in the bottom, that's representing the most protected areas of the park that are much more like the mainland. So depending on how exposed you are to the open ocean, it's a very, very different environment out in the harbor. We also know that the harbor islands have been populated by people since shortly after the glaciers melted. The ancestors of the Massachusetts tribe and others have been there for thousands of years. And there are so many known sites containing creations and artifacts associated with the indigenous cultures that just about the entire park is considered a National Register archaeological district, which for research purposes is really interesting because ecological research, because it means for the most part, we can't dig because we don't want to disturb these irreplaceable features that are underground without doing it very, very thoughtfully and with, you know, appropriate permits and everything. Also, the harbor islands are very significant in US history for navigation aids and coastal defense. In fact, pre-US history for navigation aids. Boston Light was built in 1716. It was burned down by the British as they evacuated Boston in the Revolutionary War and then rebuilt on the same foundation. And it was continuously operated by a human for more than 2 centuries and was the last human operated lighthouse in the system until Sally Snowman, Dr. Sally Snowman, who was the first female lightkeeper in the US Coast Guard history, was decommissioned from that post just a couple years ago. Lots of coastal defense structures that you can still see on the harbor islands related to coastal defense. You know, as everyone knows, Boston was a major city along the Atlantic coast and was important. It was important for Boston to be protected, you know, by these islands up through the submarine nets in the World War II. Since World War II, these functions have gone away and we've been in the park era. Also, things that happen on the islands are institutions that for the most part were not wanted in proper Boston. Things like horse rendering plants and prisons and quarantine stations and hospitals and brothels and illegal gambling houses. These are the things that happen on the islands, you know, mostly in the 1800s and into the 1900s. That's an old sewage treatment facility on Moon Island there on the top right and bottom right. And that Rainsford Island etching there was created in 1826 by the physician of the hospital that was right there on the sort of southwest corner of Rainsford Island until it burned down and now is just sort of rubble. Geologically, the importance of the harbor islands is that it's the only partially drowned drumlin field in North America, which many of you probably know, or some of you I'm sure know about drumlins. They're basically glacial sediments that get pushed and smushed by the heavy ice sheet into lumps that then get sculpted as the ice sheet is in its phase of melting and retreating. So they end up in these sort of sculpted shapes, this sort of upside down teaspoon shape demonstrated there in the top right. And many of the Boston Harbor Islands are drumlins that are part of this larger drumlin field that includes a much broader area of Boston. Actually, I've never really thought about whether Tufts is on a drumlin or not. Maybe someone here knows. But a lot of the hills right around Boston Harbor are part of the same drumlin field. Sea level rise actually fell because of the weight of the ice sheet and the bouncing back of the Atlantic plate. That's kind of a long story, but sea level rise fell a lot and then it came back up and partially drowning this drumlin field. So you can learn about glacial history in Boston Harbor in a way you can't anywhere else in the United States. Okay, now on to sort of the last phase here, and I'm blowing through my time, so I'm gonna have to go a little quicker. Now, the reason we do science in parks is really twofold. It's to make sound decisions about managing the park based on the best available science, and it's to provide the visitors with cool information. You know, Jesse's colleagues and probably you took some amazing photos this year that will probably end up on our website. So people will love pollinators more and be less afraid of bees, hopefully. At the same time, that study might help us understand what plants the pollinators are associated with. And therefore, any ecological management we do, we might want to, you know, consider this plant versus that plant because of its benefit for pollinators. In the Biden administration, our definition of science and understanding has evolved to include indigenous traditional ecological knowledge. And the Park Service, under the Department of the Interior's secretarial order, is now directed to develop co-stewardship relationships with affiliated tribal nations associated with the parks. So that's a real change to the Park Service management approach. I mentioned the 9 different landowners. Those are represented on the top right of the Boston Harbor Islands. There's kind of some of the landowners and other partners are represented in that sort of table diagram on the left. That represents the Boston Harbor Islands Partnership, with state entities in orange, nonprofits in blue, city entities, City of Boston in the darker green, and federal entities in the lighter green, and then a public advisory council. Not that easy to do things like study something that occurs all across the different properties in a context like this, or to make a management decision, for example, about protecting coastal breeding birds when they occur on 4 different landowners' land, because each landowner in this park has the right and the responsibility to manage their own land. So I work for the Park Service at this park. I'm really an advisor. When I first got to the Harbor Islands, we took this training called Leading Without Authority. And I was thinking, oh, that kind of sucks. Like, leading without authority. So we have no authority. And I didn't realize at the time what I do now about how true that is, that we are responsible to, or we have the opportunity to lead, but we have the challenge of no authority. We try to do our management in a strategic manner. I'm not going to go into that, but I would say that what I've come to realize is that the sort of collective impact model is how these complicated partnerships get things done. You get people together, the important people that are going to influence other people in organizations, and you work as hard as you need to work to get to a common agenda. And then basically you let people do their thing. And then you communicate back with each other. That's the basic principle of collective impact as I try to enact it, which is come to a common agenda, write it down, communicate about it, and then check in about how we're doing. But don't get in everyone else's business. Like if they want to do something their way and you want to do something your way, that's fine. As long as you have the same agenda in mind and you're communicating about what you're doing. Not going to go through the details here, but this is a diagram I put together to introduce people who work in our team about how critical partnerships are for everything we do. Our team is in the middle there, the Science and Stewardship Partnerships team. And all the white boxes are boxes of different sets of partners that we work with. And we really, again, have no authority to do things in the park without agreement of these other folks. Some of the major partnerships that have evolved, that have emerged, that we are part of and that I'm personally involved with is the Stone Living Lab partnership, which, as it says here, is focused on transformative research around nature-based solutions to make coastal areas resilient in the face of climate change. So instead of just building gray seawalls, think about things like oyster reefs and cobble berms and living seawalls and things like that. And it's a research, education, and sort of stewardship partnership that we're part of. Another program that has started 2 years ago, and that's the 2 year ago team, and then this year's team on the right there, just a photo last week, is a climate conservation corps, which is sort of young adults that we hire for year-long terms to help us understand, mitigate, adapt, and communicate climate change to the public and within our partnership. That picture on the bottom right is yesterday. And I've spent about 1.5 years being part of a team coordinating a major cleanup of marine trash that had accumulated for generations out on the outer islands. And yesterday we were out there as one piece of a much larger project that involved cranes and barges and all sorts of things. But we were out there with community volunteers picking up sort of the small stuff that the big part of the cleanup wasn't able to accomplish. A lot of what we do is community-based stewardship. Every researcher that comes to me, every partner that wants to do a thing on the landscape, the first question is always, how can we involve the community? How can we involve students? How can we make this a community-connected thing? We have the challenge of being a national park in an urban setting, meaning our ecosystems are not extensive and pristine, or more pristine than others. But we have the benefit of lots of people being around. So that is how our national park works, is sort of community-centric engagement around stewardship and science. On the right there is Sebastian Jones, an unbelievable birder who has taken it on himself to add our park to an international shorebird survey just this year. So I met him, I ran into him on a boat a month ago and was giving him some praise. Okay, final slide. So where does this all leave me? I've learned that pragmatism isn't just dull, it's actually developing professional skills. There's a lot of organizational skills, executive skills, sort of intellectual skills that are that absolutely were founded in me from my time at Tufts, with the sort of academic rigor that I had here, that I experienced here. But I kind of needed to do some projects to realize, to utilize those skills, the writing skills, the speaking skills, et cetera, the organizational skills. And obviously, I've made a big point about how important idealism is to me. And so I've been reflecting and putting this talk together about how to sustain it. And I think the things that make me feel like it's okay to be a professional idealist now, a professional and an idealist, is working in a mission-driven organization where I, and basically everyone I work with, believes in the same mission. The Park Service mission is really cool. We don't always do it perfectly, but it's a really good mission. And we are all public servants. I think doing public service is inherently idealistic. Working with youth, and I don't just mean little kids, I mean young adults. They're always, they remind me of myself, in my Tufts years, and they bring that sort of energy, optimism, hope, and new ideas that I personally need to sustain my own idealism. And the last thing is, not to make this into some sort of triumphant story, as I said, there's been ups and downs. There is a trade-off of working for a mission-driven government organization, which is, I'm here representing the National Park Service. I'm telling a very personal story, but I can't say a single thing about any law, policy, election, anything, because I'm not representing myself. And I don't love that. I'm an idealist. I'm a protester at heart. But when I have my Park Service Arrowhead shirt on, or I'm on the clock, I'm representing the agency. So it's a trade-off. All right, I've taken too much time. It's not as much time for questions as we might hope, but thank you.
If you have any questions, I'll bring you the mic.
Hi, thank you for your talk. Thought it was really interesting how when you were working at the Presidio, it was like a combination of working with science, plants, and people. And I was wondering how that's like influenced your profession and like played a role in your career since then.
Yeah, thanks. Basically, when I got to Boston, I tried to recreate the Presidio. When I got to, we have a program in Boston Harbor Islands called Stewardship Saturdays. And we bring community volunteers and students out to take care of the ecosystems of the park. And we baked fresh baked goods. And basically everything we did in the Presidio is what I think is amazing and what I try to do in the park now. And that includes, on those same days, collecting data while also taking care of the ecosystem, while also meeting people and forming a sort of community ritual around it. All those things that were true for me in the Presidio are what I try to encourage our park and our program to be still today.
I have a quick question, and then I can bring the mic to someone. About halfway through your talk, you said, I needed to figure out what the relevant information is. And I would like to, it's so easy as an academic or as a researcher or to get buried in information. There's so much information. how do you know what's relevant? What's your process of determining what's relevant, especially in the context of the Boston Harbor Islands when you have 9 different owners?
I mean, it's not an easy answer. I think what I would say is, just like we're supposed to use the best available science, I feel like it's my job to use the best available advisors. We're in the process of forming a science and stewardship committee of the Boston Harbor Islands Partnership, and we'll invite different technical experts in birds and plants and other areas, as well as in archaeology and tribal members of affiliated tribal nations. And we're going to utilize that as a way to help answer that question. Because I'm not really, I mean, I studied plant ecology, but I'm essentially not an expert in anything. I'm more an expert in bringing people together and thinking through how to facilitate a good discussion to answer questions like that.
I would say that's been a theme of a lot of the talks this semester, just talking about how you do community engaged research and bring people together to figure out what the important data that we might need is. So it's nice to hear.
Yeah, actually, following on that point, I also noticed that a lot of environmental practitioners tend to say, I'm not an expert or anything, but I'm very good at bringing people together and solve complex problems. So my question is, what kind of soft and hard skills make you successful in your position?
I think organizational skills are absolutely essential. And I don't mean being like, neat and tidy. I mean, looking at an overwhelming to-do list and triaging it. That's the organizational skill that's more important than a perfect spreadsheet. Constant triage of the overwhelming amount of things that are in your inbox, on your to-do list, your partnerships. I could talk to 100 partners tomorrow. Which are the 2 that I really need to talk to? So that's the biggest one. I think writing skills are essential, and it's pretty disappointing. I review a lot of resumes from people that are around the age of a lot of the people in this room, and I would say the writing skills are the worst skill. People are better at talking than they are at writing. People are better at graphics than they are at writing. People are better at organizing things than they are at writing. So writing skills. Writing good emails is a really important skill. Bottom line up front, people. You're talking to busy people, bottom line up front.
Seems like we have a question online.
Yeah, there's actually 2 online. The first states, I'd like to hear more about the expected future for natural versus hard coastal protection and how things are looking for the future of Boston Harbor.
I love that question. And, again, I think we're in a great place to figure it out because the state, the current federal government, and the city are very aligned on thinking differently about how to live with, rising water and increasing storm intensity into the future. So I think on the sort of, if there's from the context that if there's a will, there's a way. Right now, there's a lot of people with will to do that, to sort of evolve the way we think about living in a changing coast. So on that side, I think it's great. The challenge is that a lot of the Boston region is hardscaped and developed right to the edge. So it's not like we have a lot of area to play with. So there's kind of just physical factors that make that really tough. But there are a lot of smart people starting to think about it, and a lot of folks in agencies that get to make decisions that are becoming on board with the idea of thinking about it in a new way.
We are out of town. I want to thank you so much for your presentation. Could you please join me in thanking Marc Albert?